Have you ever been about to agree to something in a meeting, and just before you speak, your body pauses? Not your thoughts, your body. Your chest tightens, your breath shifts. Something in you slows down even as the room keeps moving. And it doesn't make sense because the decision looks right. And something in you isn't fully with it. Most leaders override that moment. But once you start paying attention to it, you realize that moment is rarely random. Welcome to Soulfire Leadership. This is where we talk about the parts of leadership that don't show up in frameworks or executive training, but shape the quality of every decision you make. Today, I want to look at something most experienced leaders have felt, but very few have language for. There was a meeting years ago when I was leading technology teams inside the bank. Everything about the decision made sense. The data supported it. The strategy was aligned. The room was ready to move forward. And I remember sitting there listening and feeling my body slow down. Not my thinking, my body. There was a moment when I wanted the conversation to pause. Not because I disagreed, because something hadn't fully settled yet. And nothing in the room allowed for that kind of pause. So the conversation continued. The decision was made. And like many decisions that look clean in the moment, it required far more correction later than anyone expected. And that wasn't the only time. Over the years, I started noticing a pattern. Right before certain decisions, there's a moment where the body registers something before the mind can explain it. And most leaders have felt it. They just don't stay with it long enough to understand it. We've been trained to trust what we can explain. Data, logic, structured thinking. But experience doesn't always speak in language first. It speaks in sensation. If you've spent years inside complex environments, your internal systems have absorbed thousands of patterns. What works, what fails, what looks right but isn't. What creates downstream problems that no one can see yet? That pattern recognition doesn't wait for a fully formed thought. It often shows up in the body first. A tightening, a hesitation, an almost imperceptible resistance right before you agree. That isn't uncertainty. It's recognition that hasn't been translated yet. And here's where most high performing leaders have been conditioned in a very specific way. You learn not to trust that moment. Because early in your career, hesitation could be misread. So you refined it out. You learned to arrive clear, speak cleanly, move the conversation forward. And over time, you stopped giving that pre-verbal signal space to become something you could actually use. That adaptation makes you effective, and it also creates a cost. You become very good at making decisions that are analytically sound, but slightly misaligned. And that misalignment is subtle. It doesn't show up immediately, it shows up later in the form of more complexity than expected, more rework than anticipated, more energy required to hold something together. And when you look back, you can usually trace it to a moment that didn't quite land. Not because you didn't know, because what you knew didn't have a language yet. So you move forward without it. The leaders who make the most stable decisions don't ignore that moment. They recognize it as part of the decision process. Most leadership advice stays at the level of thinking. Be more confident. Communicate clearly. Trust your judgment. But none of that addresses what happens before judgment is fully formed. Because this isn't a confidence issue, it's a timing issue. The gap between when your experience recognizes something and when your mind can explain it. And if you're only making decisions from what you can immediately articulate, you're leaving out one of the most refined forms of intelligence you have. Not emotional, not reactive, pattern-based, built over years, but only accessible if you allow that moment to exist. Once you start seeing this, you don't become slower. You become more precise, and you begin to notice that moment in real time, right before you agree, right before you commit, right before you say, yes, this works. And instead of moving past it, you stay with it for just a second longer. Sometimes nothing changes. The decision is still right. But other times, that moment opens something. A question you hadn't asked yet. A risk that hasn't been named. A piece of timing that feels slightly off. Not because you're overthinking, because your experience is speaking in the only way it can before language catches up. And when leaders learn to include that signal, their decisions don't just look right, they hold. If you've ever had the experience of agreeing to something and feeling your body hesitate just before you did, that wasn't you second guessing yourself. That was recognition arriving before explanation. Nothing about that is weak. It's one of the most advanced forms of discernment you have. And most leaders were never taught how to work with it. If this kind of conversation resonates with you, please subscribe to the channel. This is where we put language to the parts of leadership you've been sensing, but haven't heard explained this way before.